All right, so this is going to be a 10-minute pose. And again, I've switched media a little bit here. And what I'm going to do here is I want to explore the shapes of this character. So this is a little bit more character design, if you will. I'm still exploring the character, but now I'm thinking of the shape language I want to use. So this is more communicative. I'm thinking of my visual clarity. What kind of shapes can I use to get my idea across efficiently? I'm also thinking of the feeling that different shapes give me, as well as the gesture inherent in those shapes. So for academic figure drawing, I'll typically start with the gesture first. In this case, I might do a little bit of planning there. When I do this kind of character study, though, I do like to think in terms of shape more so than necessarily gesture. So I still have, concepts of line of action, that kind of thing. But what I like to think of is not just my primary line of action, which would, in this case, for me, be this S curve that runs through the figure here. But I also think of like secondary and tertiary, lines or ideas, if you will, because for me, a line is an idea. Secondary and tertiary ideas that support that principal idea. So I'm always thinking of big idea first, everything else supports that big idea. And typically that's how I approach storytelling in general. It's like writing an essay. You always have a thesis statement, and everything you write thereafter has to support that thesis statement. It's the same with the sketch, particularly, a life sketch like this. And once again, I'm not really focused on whether it's good, because it's only 10 minutes. I really just want to focus more on whether it's doing what I want it to do. So in this case, I want to go for humor, or a little bit of a visual irony kind of thing. So, the pose is kind of like a badass kind of pose, There's some contrapposto here, which gives you some more dynamic gestures running through the body. So you've got S curves, you got C curves, you got some straight lines going. So it's really nice and fun and loose and natural because of the contrapposto. After laying in my general shapes or gestures, I like getting in the face, because for me that bit of acting in the face is always just a lot of fun to do. And right now I'm just feeling my way through the character. I haven't really planned out the shapes I'm using. I'm making it up as I go. Still trying to get some kind of energy as well. So I want my shapes to have a little bit of activation almost. So with guns, I typically just kind of make sure that the silhouette reads I don't kill myself over, you know, getting the details 100% right, because again, that's something you can fix it in post kind of thing. Especially if you're using this as a study for something else or for a digital painting. I'll actually do that sometimes if I have, you know, a 1 or 30 second, either a 1 minute or 30 second kind of drawing, gesture drawing, kind of like what I did earlier, that I think is a lot of fun, and I can see it being useful, or I could see it being a more finished concept. I'll typically, you know, shoot a picture of it, clean it up in Photoshop, and then I'll paint it or develop it into whatever it is I want to develop it into, whatever it may be. So I really only need enough detail so that I know, generally speaking, what it is I'm looking at. So again, it just needs to be visually clear enough for me to kind of be able to plan things out. And then if I need to pull reference later on, if in the event of me wanting to actually develop this into an illustration, then I'll go ahead and pull reference when I have time. And it's all right to use reference for things. You don't have to try to memorize how to draw everything. You know, if you're blessed with that kind of memory, go for it. But honestly, I'm okay with using reference. So typically when it comes to clothing like this, where this is like a very, very oversized flight suit, you know, it's got a lot of ease between the actual surface of the interior of the suit itself and then the figure underneath it. So there's a lot of room there. Because it is so baggy, I have to do some serious editing. So what I'm doing as far as the editing of the clothes or the drapery is concerned is I'm really just picking and choosing whatever folds, for example, are useful. So maybe some of these overlaps here in the crook of the arm, I'm going to make sure I indicate that because it helps sell the idea of that arm being compressed, and that also gives me a little bit of foreshortening there. So I have a little bit of that Z space going into the paper there. Areas like this where it's an actual, you know, design or architectural detail, if you will, of the clothing, you know, like seam lines, or, you know, there's a little seam here behind the armpit, little details of the actual flight suit itself, construction details. Seam lines are the big one. That I do like to imply if possible, for a few reasons. It helps give you some kind of history of the character, you know, a technological background. Depending on details of the costume, you can give the viewer or your audience, whoever's looking at it, a lot of important and useful information. And you're not really calling too much attention to it. It's just there. You know, everyone's going to view it and hold on to that detail subconsciously in a way. It's really just creating a history and a world. So now it's a little bit of world building. Anytime you do incorporate structural details into articles of clothing or costuming, you do get a little bit of that magic of, oh, okay, this came from a particular universe. You know, I can kind of figure out the history of the character. So the universe we're dealing with here is, you know, it's pretty close to our own universe. It still have like similar laws of drapery, for example, physics, weight distribution. So we already know we're dealing with a world here that has like the same effects of gravity that we have here. They're not too much technologically advanced compared to us. You know, we still have, these are all elements that we currently have in our world. So already you can kind of see enough detail here to have an idea of the kind of place this character would come from. And sometimes for a 10, if I have enough time, I'll get a little bit of lighting in there. But, you know, the lighting is not my main priority here. I kind of like this in the face. So typically for a 10, I might noodle at it just a little bit more, just to give it a little bit more life. So this is the only time I would do anything similar to rendering, but this is not true rendering. It's more of like just very general kind of graphic value placement. And again, this is more information for me, pushing that concept of visual clarity. Anytime you have graphic shapes, they really help make things read very clearly and simply. So I don't want anything to be too complicated to read. I want to keep it fairly clear. But again, I'm not worried too much about polishing this. Because, I mean, this is only a 10-minute drawing. And I'm working fairly large. I'm working at 18 by 24. By the way, this is marker paper. This is not typical white paper. So it is going to be a lot slicker than your average white drawing paper. And I'm just using a Prisma on it, so it does slide around really nice. So I'm just about finishing up here. I might just imply some of these darker graphic elements. And anytime you draw or sketch, even if it's meant to just be a sketch for you, you should always keep in mind, you know, the edges of your paper. That's one thing that Bob Cotto mentioned to me a while ago, and that always stuck with me, is just being very aware of the space that you have, you know, and you can always change your frame. You can cut up pieces of paper and have random shapes and draw to those shapes, but knowing your limits here, you know, always keeping in mind, you know, I want to avoid tangents or weird alignments or any kind of strange compositional issues. That should always be like kind of running in the background there, just to keep good habits going and maintaining good habits. You don't want to break good habits. Those are always there. You learn composition for a reason, you know, you learn design for a reason. You're using all of those tools. Now you're just letting go enough so that you can focus on pursuing, you know, other aspects of creativity. But that design background, all those technical little things, that's still there, but it's background information that's running through your mind while you're drawing. So this is some of what I think about during a typical kind of characterization in 10 minutes. I'm really focused on still keeping it loose, but I'm playing with shapes. I'm playing around with gestures. I'm going for any kind of humor that I can pull from either the pose or from the model. In this case, you know, I really contorted the facial features. This is about as far from realism, you know, as you can get. Daniela looks nothing like this. So the idea is that I am pushing a little bit of acting in the figure, as well as the face, as well as the hands, as well as the feet. And I'm doing that a little bit with the contortion of the shapes. I'm doing that with how I'm playing around with that S-curve. I really pop this hip out forward. So I push that contrapposto. That's now thinking in terms of acting with the whole body instead of any individual area. So when I think about acting, I'm trying to think of how I can utilize the entirety of the pose and act with the whole figure and really distribute weight and push it around instead of focusing on acting on just the face or just the hands. You know, every shape that you lay down on paper, you've given it that breath of life. It can act because you've brought it to life. Just the mere act of putting it on paper, you've already started bringing it to life. So anything that's there, you want to push the acting, even if it's just a little subtle thing. You know, even in this area, I could have really pushed some of the acting in those shapes and really activated them a little bit more. But because again, this is only a 10-minute and I'm still just trying to work my way through building this character and trying to figure out her personality, that wasn't a priority. So I am definitely prioritizing a drawing like this. I'm not necessarily rushing through it, but I am trying to move a little bit quickly because I've got a lot of decisions to make in a relatively short amount of time. So I do need to prioritize. In this case, I thought of, you know, my shapes and my gestures first, and my acting maybe a little bit after that. I really want to make sure that I know where everything is before I commit to any finalized shapes. So geography maybe is a little tiny bit more important than necessarily acting on every aspect of the figure when I'm laying things out. But as soon as I know where everything is, my priority then switches back to acting. So I always like looking at the silhouette and pushing the acting in the silhouette, breaking down my primary, secondary, tertiary gestures to support whatever my thesis statement is. My thesis statement in this case is that sneer. You know, that's a really kind of, she is a badass, but she's got some personality. You know, she's a little bit sassy maybe. She doesn't take crap from anybody. Maybe she likes to break things. You know, maybe she likes to light things on fire. So we're going for a character who's a little bit whimsical, not malicious, but I'm trying to develop a little bit of moxie here. I really want her to be a girl that you don't really mess with, or you don't really want to mess with. You know, it helps that she's got a big old gun, but even without the gun, I want her to be precocious enough that, you know, this is someone who's interesting, that you would feel confident following into a battlefield. So that being said, I also want to push the humor. So in that case, I'm going to really contort my shapes and I'm really going to throw weight around. So that's kind of how I prioritize, you know, a character drawing. I have to make sure I know where everything is, but as soon as I know where everything goes, I want to start pushing the story and the personality a little bit more. And that's where my visual kind of irony comes in with the pose, like really contorting it. And even though it was a pretty solid action pose, you know, I gave her a lot of squishy, baggy pants here. You know, I really contorted the shapes of the shoes. So I'm trying to create a little bit of a visual irony in my decision making here. So in short, you need to prioritize a short pose like this. Anytime you have 10 minutes, it's not a lot of time. So you need to start thinking, what can I get down first? What's the most important thing I want to focus on in this 10 minutes? How can I kind of figure out a process, if you will, or a technique for developing all of those key points that I want to explore during those 10 minutes? All right, so that's a 10-minute pose focused on characterization and acting.